call the May 21st meeting of the Portsmouth City Council to order. And Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Yes, sir. Mr. Clark?
Here.
Mrs. Lucasberg? Here. Mr. Moody?
Here.
Ms. Simmons?
Here.
Mr. Smith?
Here.
Dr. Whitaker? Mayor Rowe?
Here. Although we have several items on our work session agenda, the first is a joint meeting between City Council and the Housing Authority. So, Chairman Smith, give you the opportunity to call your body to order.
Yes, sir. Roll call. Commissioner Lalonde? Here. Commissioner Roberts?
Here.
Commissioner Chapman?
Here.
Commissioner Cofield?
Here.
Commissioner Harris? Vice Chair Washington? Here. And myself here. Thank you, Mayor.
We have at least one item on the agenda, but we do have a need to have a joint closed meeting. And I think council for both the City Council and the Housing Authority have developed the appropriate resolution. So when we get to that, council will adopt this resolution, and then the Housing Authority will adopt theirs. Assuming that they pass, we'll go into a joint closed session. All right, Dr. Pat?
Yes. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of City Council and members of PRHA Board. The presentation this evening is the city's Community Development Block Grant CDBG Land Presentation Review of 91 properties of land owned by PRHA and acquired using the city's HUD CDBG funds. The development of this presentation has been through the work of the city's Planning Department, Economic Development, and Mr. Brian Donahue, Director for Development for PRHA. The work of this team has taken approximately 2 years and required research, rezoning assessment, flood zone impact, as well as determining the economic development tiering. The HUD national objectives of which the properties were acquired were also a part of the review. As a result, the team's efforts, they were able to identify developable parcels, identify the most appropriate approach for redevelopment, and to minimize properties that are tax exempt and require perpetual maintenance. The overall goal of the team's effort is to place properties back on the city's tax roll. There are 2 areas of we would like to discuss this evening in the ultimate disposition of several residential properties located in the Craddock and the Parkview historical districts. Mr. Bob Baldwin, Director of Planning, is the presenter, and we also have Mr. Robert Moore and Mr. Brian Donahue, who are present if there are any questions. Mr. Baldwin.
Thank you, Dr. Patton. Good evening, everyone. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to be before you tonight. And for City Council, some of this will seem familiar to you. It's very similar. In fact, it's pretty much the same presentation we did back in March with your joint meeting with the Economic Development Authority. So again, this is a review of the CDBG land, and as Dr. Patton indicated, this is a process we've been working through in some detail, working with the PRHA staff up until we've reached the point of getting to the end. And I know PRHA had done a similar sort of final effort on their end. So just very quickly, kind of an overview of what we were looking at here and some reminders for people under the CDBG program. What we're looking at here, again, is a review of PRHA held property that was purchased using the city's CDBG entitlement funds. As the CDBG entitlement, ultimately the city is responsible for the land to HUD. CDBG funds cannot be used for property maintenance, and I know that's an issue that is of concern regarding these undeveloped properties. When we initially started looking at the properties, there were actually more properties than what's left. Some, for example, with the Wendy's site, have already been taken off the PRHA property list and put into private hands. So where we are today, we're basically looking at 91 parcels, and when we did the process, we developed maps into different areas. There are 33 areas, so inside the presentation and presentation materials, you'll see the different areas where we identified the properties. And a lot of what we did early on was taking a large list of properties and trying to put them into some sort of organized form for presentation. So that's how that was done. And again, as Dr. Patton mentioned, we looked at these properties from a number of angles. Some of those we looked at the sizes of the parcels, their potential for development. We looked at it in relation to the zoning, surrounding land use. We looked at their flood zone, a number of those factors. Again, we're dealing with CDBG property. Must be used for CDBG eligible activity that meets the national objective. Otherwise, HUD may require repayment by the city. If the land is sold, otherwise disposal for use that doesn't meet the national objective, the city owes HUD fair market value. And I think I've mentioned this before. The way we've worked this out with PRHA, we'll take either the city's assessed value of the property as meeting fair market value, or an appraisal can be done. Either one of those is an appropriate method for determining what the fair market value is. And again, all proceeds from the sale of the land, even if the property sold meeting a national objective, those are owed to HUD. Those are ultimately returned to the city's CDBG line of credit for future CDBG activity. So again, the CDBG properties, when they're sold, the money goes to HUD, comes back into the city's line of credit. So very quickly, the initial list here is going to be worth some discussion, I believe. We identified as properties that would remain initially with PRHA. That consisted of 29 parcels in 6 areas in the maps. Some of these, as you can see in the top part of that list, the properties acquired as part of a project, acquired as part of West Bay Area or what have you. We do have a couple of lists down here that I think we'll have some additional discussion. Again, as Dr. Patton mentioned, the properties that were acquired in Craddock originally using CDBG-R funds, and the council members may recall the city paying back HUD for those properties. So those properties are now held by PRHA, and they're free and clear. They have no obligation back to HUD for those properties. And the other are properties that are in Parkview, and there's a number of lots remaining in Parkview. I think people are familiar with those properties. The national objective requirement has been removed by HUD. However, the repayment at fair market value is still required for those. So any property sales in Parkview, the fair market value is a requirement, and that would go back to HUD. So that's that first list. And I'm just, since the people have the packages before them, I'm going to very quickly kind of go through the maps, just kind of show the general location of where these properties are. And again, we start with Area 1 as we identified these properties. You can see the Parkview lots. So that's the first grouping of properties.
Are any of those properties on the clock as far as repayment?
Technically, I'd say they're not on the clock. However, I think there is, as we've mentioned before, some of these properties in this list have been were acquired back as far as the 1970s, and HUD does like you to use your money in a timely fashion. So I would, as I've said before, our biggest concern if we were to have an audit or some sort of a thing by HUD to come in and take a look at these properties, whether or not they would be wondering why these properties were still sitting, not meeting a national objective, and they could make a finding you haven't met the national objective, and like they did with the lots in Craddock, they could demand a repayment.
Go back to page 3 or slide 3, please. Again, Craddock is free and clear.
That's correct.
So the lots could be given away.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But under 5,
the park
national objective has been waived, but the repayment to
has not.
HUD
Has not. Exactly. Quite often, and again, I'll use go back and use the Wendy's site as an example here. The Wendy's redevelopment did not meet the national objective for which the property was acquired under the CDBG. Therefore, at the sale of the property, all the proceeds from and that was, as you may recall, there was I think it was 11 lots in that. The ones that were acquired using CDBG, we worked out an arrangement with PRHA to split the value of the property between the CDBG acquired and the non-CDBG acquired, and the CDBG piece, that money was returned back to HUD. And that was property that did not meet the national objective, so we had to pay back. Parkview being that same kind of category.
Vice Mayor.
Are all of these lots, these are all lots, there's no building on any of this
That's
property?
correct. These are all vacant.
It's all
lots.
just land, okay.
Dr. Wood.
Can you go back to slide 2? Under the third bullet point, when it says all proceeds from sale of land, what do you mean by proceeds?
Well, typically what will happen when a property is sold, there are certain, we'll talk about net proceeds here.
Okay.
So there's an allowance that we make for typical things in a real estate sale would be attorney's fees, titling fees, appraisal fees. All that is eligible for payment out of the proceeds of the sale. Anything above and beyond that is the proceeds that would be proceeds would be returned.
So either way, you're going to pay HUD something, either the net proceeds or the fair market value?
Yes.
Yeah, you got it.
Unless, if you're meeting a CDBG national objective, quite often we'll do that without a cost to the developer, and that's also does not require repayment to HUD if you're meeting your national objective. Now, quite often you do negotiate. That's obviously CDBG required property, and if you do get funds back from that transaction, that would go back into your line of credit, so you could use for additional CDBG activity. So, where you can, you like to get some proceeds from the sales to further your CDBG account line.
How many options have we had where we have not met the national objective? I mean, where it was, is it often or is it not? So
It's fairly common. I'll just say that I couldn't give you off the top of my head.
Okay.
It's fairly common. We've had ones that over the years, the ultimate development of the property did not meet the national objective for which it was initially acquired. Okay. So move to the second grouping. These are the ones we would identify as being transferred to the city, and this is what was discussed with the Economic Development Authority. These are 39 parcels of non-residentially zoned land. Makes up 12 areas in your map, 9 acres. This is property, again, as part of that review process we went through with the Brian Donahue and the PRHA staff, as well as the city staff, where the city's Economic Development Department said, this is property we would like to have for future economic development activity. We believe we can develop that property. So those are those parcels. And again,
because this is being televised, the title to all these properties are in the possession of
PRHA.
Yeah.
Exactly. They're in PRHA's hands. All the property we're talking about tonight is PRHA held properties.
Any questions on this?
That was the last part of that list. It was actually on two different frames here. And again, you have in your packets.
Question. What is 110 High Street?
Next to the old Wendy's, not Wendy's, but Wynn Seafood.
No,
That's
it's not 110.
Let's see.
That's 1700 block.
Oh, that must be a typo. in
Area
here.
2.
Yeah, in Area 2. Let's go back and look at the map here. Yeah, that's that area where Primrose comes into High Street
Okay,
there.
it's not 110, it's a typo.
Yeah,
That's
that's
like
a typo.
1600 block or
Yeah.
something.
we said that we didn't correct that. We said that we didn't catch it.
We'll
correct that.
but that's the location on that corner there.
Bill's got
Two different sides. I see it now.
What's currently being done to market the non-commercial properties?
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
What's being done to market the non-commercial properties?
Not a lot at this time. We haven't had any interest in the non-commercial properties at this point. Because I think, as we heard earlier, these properties been out there probably 10, 15, 20 years.
I understand, but that makes it even more critical, I think, to market them, get them on the tax rolls, and fill some vacant slots in these communities.
But isn't that what you're saying, is these would go to these?
Well, that's part of what we're
going to discuss.
suggesting is,
Suggest.
would you like those to move over to the city and let the city take the lead? And
I would,
moving
yeah.
the property?
Well, let's go back to the list again.
Now, all these non-residential, these are all commercial. You're talking about the residential piece? And there's
Commercial.
a commercial piece, okay.
Right there.
Is there any disagreement in either board that these properties come to the city? Dr. Wood?
Yeah, that's my question. Why are these properties reverting back to the city?
For development.
Well, I think if we go back to the sort of beginning of the process, the joint conversations, again, a lot of these properties have been sitting vacant for a long time.
Right.
And I know that the PRHA, at least the staff representing to us, that they spend a fair amount of money in maintaining properties that aren't developed. And I think part of the discussion was to try to find an alternate way to move the properties. I think because the city is ultimately responsible to HUD for whatever happens with the properties. The idea was to, at least on the commercial side, use that where our economic development department has indicated they believe they could move these properties, to take those and move those over to the city side.
But I guess the question is, by reverting it back to the city, I thought that means that now the city would have to be responsible financially for maintaining those properties.
That would be correct.
And so, what is the benefit of reverting it back when you can still pursue development without it changing the ownership interest? That's where I'm not clear on. I mean,
From our perspective, we've got a Department of Economic Development that's
Right.
staffing up.
Right.
Everybody saw the article.
Which I don't see what the ownership issue has to do with marketing the property, because it's already in that status right now, and to me that's adding an additional financial burden on the city, and that's where I'm not clear on why we're taking on that financial burden when we can still pursue development at its current status.
I'll answer with my opinion. I think it's easier to develop something if you own it.
Yes, you can. Okay, we can.
Well, we're not developing it. We're going to try to sell it for development. Is that correct?
But it's still easier.
Well, I'm asking,
Yeah.
we're not trying to develop the property ourselves.
Yeah, ourselves not,
We're
but they're
looking to sell it.
developers to.
Right. So what's the difference? And I don't see the difference in selling it as
We have a
present
staff
status.
we have a professional staff to do that, who's
Right.
8 for 8 right
Which
now,
I,
and
which I agree.
need something to do.
I agree we have the staff
Isn't
to
that
do
great?
it. My question is, how is changing ownership changing what the staff is going to do? It's not going to, I don't see the difference.
Oh, you up there.
Nate.
Well, I think one thing, it's beneficial for us to bring it back to the city in that respect, but also the maintenance of it. I believe that's going to take some burden off of PRHA with the cost that they're paying to do the maintenance when we have, the ability and the workers and equipment to do the maintenance. So I think it would just be easier to combine it together, and that would relieve some burden from that body.
Bill.
Also, on the commercial end, we have a company, I think, a retainer, a commercial real estate company that will help sell these.
yes.
So I think that's a big point right there.
I just didn't know if that was a difference, whether we own it or not, whether they can market it. I thought that we were going to market it at its present state.
And I answered you with my opinion. In my opinion, I think it's much easier to get traction and have it develop if you own it and market it. Dr. Bland. Mr. Bland.
And I agree, if the city had possession of the property, they have what I call the big picture, what they want to see, and they can better market the property along with other property they may have in that particular area. So I think the better job of marketing the property the city can do as part of what they see as economic, commercial for the area.
I agree. I agree with that. I noticed the tone has changed since our earlier meeting. I thought the earlier meeting was the council wanted the properties to stay with PRHA, so there
There's
wouldn't be
some
a
that's
burden.
gonna stay.
Right, the residential.
And strategically, Mayor, and with the new board, and hopefully I'm not stepping all over myself here, but we want to get focus back into housing and that primary thing that we should be focused on. The last couple of meetings we've had, you've challenged us, and we've challenged ourselves to collaborate much more with the city, much more with economic development. We've been attending their meetings, and we wanted to take this. I mean, the list was over 100 and something when we first started. Well, we need to do those things that we do best. And obviously, as you said, y'all have strategically made a move too on with economic development. Hey, that's what we want. We both want the best for the city,
Yeah.
but if there's a focus we want to do, we want to focus as many assets as we can on housing. We're not giving you everything. There's those properties that we still feel that, hey, we can market, we can make money from it to help us with the housing side. But these, we're not throwing up our hands. We're just saying, hey, we want to collaborate the best we can, pass it to y'all and say, okay, let's do the best we can and give it to y'all, let y'all do it.
The other piece of that is you owning the property gives you the advantage, as the mayor has said, to develop it in the direction that you want to take it. But if we're still holding it and we see opportunities and we're not collaborating as smoothly, or we are primarily responsible for it. We're going to take the initiative to go in the direction that best fits our organization. So what this process is trying to get to is what you see you want, we want you to take and do, and we still hold what we think will be of the greatest benefit to the HUD organization.
I agree with everything you're saying. I think that you, and when I say you, I'm talking about PRJ. Of course, you have a self-interest in shifting these properties over to us because this takes a significant financial burden off of you. So I would expect to hear. I'm just curious, how is it that this is benefiting the city by transferring the ownership and the financial burden? If I were sitting in your seat, I'd be saying the same thing you were saying.
Right. Because we're going to move them faster and get tax money off
but
of
not as owners. I don't
No,
think
this is going to come under the EDA.
Right.
And there
I'm just
are,
talking about the financial.
Oh,
burden.
well,
That's
if
all.
they move like this, then they're out of our hands.
Right.
And the difference with us is we've been holding these properties
30
for
years.
not days or weeks or months, but
30
years and
I
years.
totally agree with you.
All right, Ray asked for the floor.
And as far as economic development is concerned, we just cutting out the middleman.
Yes.
We can deal
Yes.
directly.
Yes. That's a
what I
good
see.
plus.
What hinders economic development from doing what they're going to do?
Well, if the
President.
properties, they are controlling it, and you got to go through them, and you work together on it. But now they can go directly to a developer, and where PHRA don't necessarily have to be at the table.
It's all paper.
Well,
No, it's not
you
paid.
can look at it any way you want.
All right. Oh, Bill, you want?
Looks like there's agreement, at least on the commercial side, to transfer those to the city, but what I would like to see after that occurs, I would like to see a status update quarterly on where it is in that process of being sold. You know, has it been assigned to our commercial real estate company? If so, you know, how many days, how many months have they had it? Which also brings up a question, how often is that put out for bid? I take it that's a bid process to appoint a commercial realtor?
Yeah, that's a bid process. When does it come back?
And it'd probably be good to find out how effective they are. I know they've got
And they are effective.
They're 8 for 8.
They're 8 for 8 right now. They just made a presentation to the EDA this past meeting.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
But still, I'd like to see a listing quarterly on the status of these or any other properties that the city
We can get that.
is in the process of selling.
Lisa.
And we had previously looked at your retreat when I was in attendance, the color-coded sheet, and I know that there's some properties that you do want to keep. Were these some of the ones that were on, I don't know, did you see the sheet, Baldwin?
I've seen a couple of different colored sheets. But I can say that from all initial discussions, this has always been on the list to come over.
Okay.
I'll say that from the beginning. We've got a lot of colored sheets.
Let's move on to the next category.
So the next category, this is just a sort of a random non-neighborhood listing of residential parcels that have, again, been sitting vacant for some period of time. Our analysis indicated of these properties, that these appear to be developable residential properties. And in our initial look at it, and as we discussed at the meeting with the Economic Development Authority, again, the question as we pose with the Parkview and the Craddock properties, whether these other residential properties should be transferred over to the city to try to pursue development on these individual parcels, or should they be left with PRHA? Well, they're in that same category.
Is there a staff recommendation on this? Apparently not. All right. Well,
The Wendy's property, was that residential or always commercial?
Just commercial.
And that was owned by the city or PRHA?
PRHA.
Right, and so when that was marketed, that went through PRHA?
Right.
The EDA was not involved at all?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I think I mentioned, as we got through the process, we actually had an agreement between the planning department and the EDA for the disposition of the funds to make sure the CDBG funds were accounted for. But that was all through PRHA.
Okay.
Well, let's have some conversation on this. I mean, what's the sentiment? Who continues to own the title? Should it be the housing authority or the city?
I'd like to know what Mr. Moore thinks.
The question is, what is the staff recommendation?
What is our recommendation?
Oh, Mr. Boyd.
Go ahead.
We would go ahead and transfer the title to the city.
That's your recommendation?
Yes.
That represents the sentiment of your board?
Yes.
All right, what's the sentiment of city council?
These vacant parcels?
Yes. Take them?
Yeah.
Ray? All right, what'd you think? Yes to
Yes,
Bill?
Yes, but I have a question. I mean, on this slide and the one before it, it says it's 9 acres on both of them? I mean, all of the properties?
That's total.
Total?
That's total.
It's 9 acres
Right.
for all 17 and then 39?
It's coincidental? It's coincidental?
Yes, it is.
I'm for the city taking it. What's your?
I would take that.
Yes, I agree.
No, I think we can achieve the same objective without taking on the financial burden on the city.
Either way?
Some kind of mixed.
Okay. Well, the majority of council feels that we should take it.
These last 6 parcels, our assessment identified them as being undevelopable, either too small or oddly shaped or lacking access. I think you can just see that by looking at the shapes of some of these parcels. They're very small or odd. And so we had those on the, whoever ends up with those is going to likely end up with those unless you can find an adjacent property owner willing to take the property. So that would be the first, and really the only alternative would be to find an adjacent property owner who would be willing to take it.
You all would keep those.
Mr. Bowen? And then that would fall under the national objective?
That would depend on the national objective. We'd have to look at each parcel independently. It's possible depending, but we would have to look at each one of those individually.
In the case of these,
Undeveloped.
especially like that crazy little triangle there at Mount Vernon, does it ever make sense to even just give that property, half of each, to the adjacent owners just so it becomes taxable?
And staff would recommend in those cases, at least from our conversations, that even if you had to pay HUD back some small amount of money, it'd be worth doing that.
Sure.
That'd be exactly what we would recommend.
You don't have to cut the grass, it becomes taxable, it makes sense.
You find a way to have the property owners accept the property and let it become privately maintained.
But we're going to leave those with PRHA and let them
Well, those are up for grabs right at the moment, but
Elizabeth says keep it with
yeah.
the housing authority. What's the sentiment?
Well, I mean, we know they're undevelopable. What is the housing authority? What is their thought on it?
Yeah, they already have.
No, but do they want to get rid of them? And I understand why.
They do.
But I'm just saying, and I understand why you want to get rid of them. But my thought is who would be the best people to go talk to the landowners adjacent to them to try to get them to accept the land? And my thought is that if we did it, there would be no cost to that homeowner or property owner to receive that land, but to get them where we don't have to maintain them anymore, just who would be the person to make that happen?
Well, let me
Hold on. Bill had his hand up.
Okay.
Actually, to Nathan's point, I think the city is in the best position to make contact and see if the contiguous properties are really interested in taking half of it.
And I would concur with that because I've talked with a couple of residents that are near those properties that are interested in some of these properties, and we can't have that conversation.
Maybe an effective way to do this. How many people, if they just indicate by raising one of their hands, feels that the property could be best disposed of by the city? If you'd
I think so.
That's everybody. So,
Anybody against it? Okay. All right. So we'll, all right.
okay.
Question, have we considered auctioning these properties?
Bill had asked that question at the EDU meeting.
Yeah, a few months ago.
Can we auction?
Back in March. What was the outcome of that?
Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council, and PRHA, there may be an opportunity to determine that again. I think with regard to all of the residential areas, the auction, a pure auction, is a bit of an issue because, of course, some of these properties are in areas you want to make sure, and I use this example talking to staff, if Solomon Ashby buys a property at auction for $100, the question is, am I in the best position or capable of putting that into play in compliance with all the rules around it? So while pure auction may not be the best option, but there probably does need to be some strategic marketing to make sure that you get the development. If you don't auction it, you hand it off to an adjacent landowner. That's probably the simplest, but you want to make sure that someone is going to complete the project. So I wouldn't necessarily say auction for everything, but there may be some other opportunities.
I just want, can I follow up on that? Because we have properties now that professional developers have been involved with for PRHA that haven't been developed. So I don't understand how you concluding that someone who would pay less wouldn't finish out development.
Well, I'm talking about if you go to an auction, all you have to commit to is paying a dollar amount. You're not committing to, it may not be a business owner, and we certainly have folks at different levels. So the concern is to make sure you get a completed product. Whatever the configuration might be, is to make sure you get a completed product in terms of putting it play.
And getting it back on the tax roll.
Councilman Whitaker, that I don't think that has anything to do with the wherewithal to develop the property. I mean, I could buy it, and might buy it on my last dollar, and not be able to do anything with it from that point. So an auction could work the same way. Matter of fact, I think someone going to an auction probably considers himself in a better financial position because you have to put money before you leave that auction to secure the property. So I think it's the quickest way to, some of these properties, as we just discussed, been vacant for years. Why not try something different? I mean, you keep doing the same old thing.
Gotcha. You're next. Ray's next.
Wait a minute, let's back up. Aren't we talking about these little undeveloped pieces right here?
Right here.
We're not talking about all the other.
No.
So who would want them? But other than the property, there's nothing to buy.
Related to the bigger.
So small.
I'm talking about everything.
I'm talking. Well, that's
Not the small
Okay,
stuff.
well, that's the subject. Is this undeveloped stuff that's too small? That's what was on the table.
All right.
Not everything.
Nate.
Right, I agree with both, all three, I should say. I agree with auctions, but that's the ones that are developable in the neighborhoods. But I understand the point that Ray's making. The undevelopable ones, they're not really marketable as an auction because the only thing they'd be beneficial is somebody to an adjacent property. And, to me, the goal would be to have that adjacent property owner take it over because that would relieve the burden of the city, even if we had to pay back HUD, and that way we don't do the maintenance for another 30, 40 years on it.
Right.
So I agree with both. I just know it got a little muddy there because we were talking about two different things.
Yeah,
We get that. But I agree with both sides.
All right. Now that we have consensus on the categories, and there were some dissenters, can we get consensus on directing the administration for both the city and the housing authority to go ahead and prepare the documents necessary to implement the change in title? Everybody in agreement on that?
Yeah.
All right. So if you, Dr. Patton, if you would work with the executive director.
Yes.
Mr. Solomon with the council for the housing authority and get back.
James. Yes.
Certainly.
We will.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can let me just ask this?
Yes, sir.
Just curious, back to that auction point, why wouldn't it be in council's interest to allow PRHA to auction those properties off before we take ownership so that we wouldn't incur those financial burdens?
That's a good question. Now, I'm going to answer your question with my position. I'm speaking for me. I'm not speaking for council. I think Solomon's point about at an auction, you run the risk of someone just buying the property to be buying it and not to develop it. I think you have a better chance of that taking place if you sit down face to face and you get to choose who you sell it to. You have a greater success of bringing about the development. And that's what we want. We want development. We want not this property to continue to remain vacant, even if it's owned by somebody other than these two entities. And again, that's my thinking.
I think that same contingency can be put on an auction. I mean, there has to be an agreement there. I just think it's a faster way. If we keep doing what we've been doing, it's going to set some of these things going to sit vacant for another 10 years.
Yes, my concern is the homeowners who are living to these undeveloped properties. What if they choose not to buy because they are seniors, or they have no interest in developing? Then we would be able to go to auction because somebody else may want to come in and maybe put, I don't know, a community park or community garden or something of that nature. So I'd say go to the homeowners first, and then if that's not an option, then we go to auction with it.
Once again, I'm talking about the total, not just undeveloped. And also, I think, too, that our interest should be getting in on the tax roll.
Yes.
Then the development piece may come later, but at least we're not sitting there all these years with it being non-taxable. So I was just curious.
Good points. But I think we have a consensus. Okay. Before we go into closed session, do you have items that you want to bring up?
No, sir.
All right. Well, we have a need to talk about three things, and on council side, there's a motion, and one of them deals with a matter that you may be conflicted on. And
Yes.
we'll take that third.
Yes. The last item.
With a member of council offer a motion to go in closed session.
I move to go into closed meeting A pursuant to Virginia Code subsection 2.2-3711A.3 for the purpose of discussing the disposition of publicly held real property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body, specifically regarding commercial development at Seaboard Square. And B, pursuant to Virginia Code subsection 2.2-3711A.3 for the purpose of discussing the disposition of publicly held real property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body, specifically regarding publicly owned vacant residential lots in Park View. And do we do C now?
Yeah.
And C, pursuant to Virginia Code subsection 2.2-3711A.3 for the purpose of discussing the disposition of publicly held real property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body, specifically regarding the Afton Green development, 4300 George Washington Highway and 0 George Washington Highway, tax parcel 0461-0080, 0090, 0100, and 0110.
Second.
Okay. We have a motion that's been duly made and seconded, and Councilman Mooney says that he will leave the discussion when we get to item C. If you would
Yes.
reflect that in the...
And that's on the appearance of a conflict, because I have no interest, financial or otherwise, in that property other than employer.
Good. Okay, any further discussion? Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Mrs. Lucas-Burke?
Yes.
Mr. Moody?
Yes.
Ms. Simmons?
Yes.
Mr. Smith?
Yes.
Dr. Whitaker?
Yes.
Mayor Rowe?
Yes. And Chairman Smith, do you have a motion?
Yes, sir. Actually, I have a resolution to read.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Resolution of intent to meet in closed meeting. Whereas the Virginia Freedom of Information Act provides that the Portsmouth Redevelopment Housing Authority, Board of Commissioners, PRHA, and the Portsmouth City Council can meet in a closed meeting for discussion or consideration of acquisition of real property for public purpose or of the disposition of publicly held real property, where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body as set forth in Section 2.2-3711A3 of the Code of Virginia as amended. The matters for consideration are the disposition of real properties located at 1. Seaboard Commons, 2. Afton Green Development, and 3. Parkview CDBG properties. Now therefore be it resolved that it complies with the Virginia Freedom of Information Act and above referenced section of the Virginia Code. The PRHA Board of Commissioners and Portsmouth City Council shall reconvene a closed meeting on May 21st, 2018 to discuss and consider disposition of publicly held real property A3. Chair's in need of a motion to go in closed session.
I make a motion that we move into closed session as read by our chairman. Second.
Second. Commissioner Lalonde?
Yes.
Commissioner Roberts?
Yes.
Commissioner Chapman?
Yes.
Commissioner Harris absent. Vice Chair Washington?
Yes.
And myself, yes. I'm sorry, Commissioner Cofield?
Yes.
All right.
We got it.
The two bodies are in closed session, and if you're not in that meeting,
See ya.